大家午安 ，Good afternoon。今天呢，先温馨提示，我们今天有中英翻译。那如果中文使用者的朋友，你需要的话，可以怎么样啊？可以到外面拿。我根本不知道他们放在哪里。Yeah, so it's lovely we have English and Mandarin interpretation live. So if you're English speaker, you need to, then we have the service here, and then it's out there. So serve yourself. So I'm gonna welcome by speaking Mandarin. 谢谢大家今天来到，That's fine 谢谢大家今天来到我们 Curatoké Curate， 然后跟 Karaoke 的这个Curatoké 我自己I invented Curatoké 这个 Performance Curator Academy program。我们这个今天的公开讲座，那 Curatoké 表演策展人学院呢是北艺中心跟国家文化艺术基金会国艺会，我们在今年经过1年多的筹划，我们今年正式发动第1届的这一个人才培育、专业人才培育训练课程。那顾名思义呢，我们是希望透过表演艺术机构表演艺术机构在业界里面它能够扮演的一种人才培育的这一个角色跟这个功能下，我们去推动next generation 的一个表演策展人的一个机会。那这个机会呢，不只是希望能够带领台湾的不管是表演艺术以及视觉艺术的制作人，或是策展人，或者是艺术管理者，能够有学习策展或是学习策展思维这个 curatorial thinking 的这一个机会。那我们其实也把这样的一个年轻学员的spectrum 拉到国外，也就是说我们在进行这个课程的时候，邀请了6位资深的策展人导师 ，experience 的策展人导师，然后跟8位透过公开甄选，那所招来的年轻的策展人学员。那这8位呢，分别是4位来自台湾，然后另外4位来自爱沙尼亚、印尼、香港跟澳洲。那藉由这样的一个机会，我们其实也希望年轻的策展人学员，他们也可以横向的在他们自己 horizontal 的一个网络里面，可以跟同儕们进行更多的学习跟交流，不只是纵向的跟策展人导师学习这样子。那这一个课程呢，基本上我们是从前天开始了，对。我已经活到忘记，对，前天开始了，对，那我们特别在今天下午呢，有在一个同样的主题之下，然后有2段的一个panel discussion。那其中一位策展人导师呢，是来自巴西的 Panorama 艺术节，在 Rio 的艺术节的艺术总监 Nice Lopez。那因为他因为个人家庭的健康因素，他这次临时没有办法前来。那所以因为时差关系，现在他是凌晨的4点，对，所以我们今天就他不会在现场跟我们一起对谈，但是针对我们内部的训练课程，那一直他会用线上的方式下礼拜跟学员授课。好，那今天呢？今天的这一个主题框架是 Curating for Arts Ecosystem in Flux。那在这一个主题之下，我们首先要邀请其中3位策展人导师，分别是新加坡滨海艺术中心的节目总监 Faith。好， 墨尔本艺术中心亚太表演艺术3年展 Asia Topa 的创意总监跟策展人 Jeff Kang， 还有在布鲁塞尔的 Kunst Festival des Arts 布鲁塞尔艺术节的联合艺术总监之一 Daniel。今天我们会先邀请3位策展人，先跟我们分享他们各自的他们的来历，包括说where you are from, what you have been doing。那在这样的一个脉络之下，那我们再会借由一个交流问答的过程，然后来讨论他们各自的实践，可能会跟我们进行更多的案例分享。那环绕在就是在他们各自的不管是geopolitical 或者是 culture political 的各种层面之上，他们怎么样透过策展工作，在跟这个所谓艺术生态系统对话。那这个艺术生态系统呢，你可以理解成在他们自己各自的区域、城市、国家，或者是特定的文化处境里面，他们作为一个艺术的策展人，怎么样透过策展作为一种方法，或者是表演作为一种工具，然后来跟他们的观众，来跟他们的特定的社会情境对话。那maybe could we invite Jeff, and then Daniel, and then Faith? Yeah, yeah. Oh, would you like to speak some words first, 3 of you? No, nothing to say. Yeah, maybe Jeff, would you like to go first to give us a brief contextualization of how to access your curatorial practices?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me so much. I have been coming to Adam probably for all 8 editions, and it's become a really important touchstone in my curatorial practice. And I think it's a real pleasure to be able to sort of build a community, especially when we're working in Asia Pacific practice across that time, and have the opportunity for so many of us in the room to be not only connected but deepen those connections year after year. And I think that work is what makes a platform like Curatoké, which is new this year, possible for us to sort of be able to share our practice, because we've been sharing it with each other as mentors for such a long time now. So I just want to acknowledge that and acknowledge how special it is to be here at TPAC and at Adam, and thank you and the TPAC team for bringing us together. Yes, so I am from Australia. I was born and raised in Perth, which is the most isolated capital city in the world. The nearest capital city is a 2-day drive away, and you grow up really feeling like you're on the edge of the earth and in the middle of nowhere. And that has strangely really informed my curatorial practice, because not only as a curator, but just as a human, growing up in Perth, you're constantly striving for connection to other people and other places, and dealing with trying to sort of remedy the sense of sort of isolation and inertia that you experience in a place like that. And I think that's really sort of laid a real foundation that still informs my curatorial practice for till today. But I began my career really in the visual arts, in the museum and gallery sector. But again, sort of growing up somewhere like Perth, where there is a very thriving contemporary art community, but it's very small, you quickly come to the edges of a discipline very, very quickly. And it's just not enough if you're a creative human to be stimulated by all of the available contemporary visual art, because there's not much. So I sort of grew up experiencing visual art alongside theatre and contemporary dance, public practice, socially engaged work, and a lot of other art forms. And that has also fundamentally informed my curatorial practice, which is very interdisciplinary and quite experimental in its approach, works across spaces from theatres and galleries to public spaces and unconventional spaces like nightclubs and sports arenas. All of those things, I think, have become a sort of pillar of my curatorial thinking. But when I think about it, those seeds were planted just through my teenagehood and study years and being a young person in the most isolated capital city in the world. But now I'm the creative director of Asiatopa, and perhaps then if we could bring up my slide number 1, it's just the Asiatopa website. But Asiatopa is the Asia Pacific Triennial of Performing Arts. So it's a triennial festival that was founded, it's very recent actually. The first edition was held in 2014 and the second in 2017 and the second in 2020, just on the eve of the pandemic. Don't worry, you're not missing much. It's just a website that I wanted to show. And so the last edition of the triennial happened right at the edge of the pandemic in February, March 2020. And in fact, about 80% of the festival was delivered before Melbourne went into its first lockdown. And artists and collaborators and guests dive-rolled under the borders and flew home before their countries became sealed for the next few years. And so sort of 5 years, well, 3 or 4 years passed, and during that time, not only did international travel become impossible, but the world changed very dramatically, both through the pandemic, but through giant global movements like the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement, very sort of seismic social shifts in global culture, as well as sort of after 2 editions, there being a bit of a desire to see a refreshing of the artistic model of Asiatopa. I think you learn a lot, an institution learns a lot by doing a festival like that, and there was a bit of a desire to see a refreshment of the artistic leadership. So that's where I came in, and I've been with Asiatopa for about nearly 2 years, developing the next edition, which will be in February, March 2025 next year. So it will have been 5 years since the last edition of Asiatopa, which is a very long time in between festivals. So both that's been an opportunity to create a new vision, but also a real challenge around how we reconnect with our communities, not only the artists and collaborators and the many kind of curators and festival colleagues who we work with, but our audiences in Melbourne and our relationship to the local arts landscape and the local community. Asiatopa is actually an initiative of an institution called Arts Centre Melbourne, and Arts Centre Melbourne is the government led state theatre centre of Victoria, the state where Melbourne's the capital city. It's a big sort of multi-campus theatre centre that encompasses about 5 main stages, from a 2,000-seat concert hall to a black box proscenium theatre to a 10,000-person outdoor music bowl. It's also situated in what's called the Melbourne Arts Precinct, which is undergoing a lot of redevelopment. So it's surrounded by a lot of other large galleries, theatre and dance companies, public gathering places, who all become our collaborators for the festival. So it's kind of got this interesting position in relationship to the Arts Centre, where the triennial is based at this kind of complex of theatres in the middle of the city, but it happens also in all of our neighbouring institutions collaborate with us to commission and present work. And then the festival radiates across the city, across about 15 different venues, from very small scale experimental spaces to other sort of very large art centres. So it's got a sort of dynamism to it that might not otherwise be possible if it was just delivered in the context of the art centre, whose stages suggest a very particular type of work, and usually sort of year round it's full of much more classical kind of art forms, a lot more sort of, much more Western art forms actually, from ballet to text-based theatre to opera. And so Asiatopa is sort of like a bit of an intervention into this institution that is used to operating a particular way in a year-round program to bring this Asia-Pacific focused triennial. And that was really, I guess, at the heart of my thinking when I came in to reimagine it, really sort of what it means to curate a festival of Asia-Pacific contemporary performance in Melbourne and in an institution like the Arts Centre. And here's our website. It's not very exciting at the moment because we're launching a new one soon. It's a bit of an anticlimax, sorry. So essentially the new vision sort of revolves around Asiatopa being Australia's major triennial festival of Asia-Pacific contemporary performance. And in thinking about that, what I've been thinking about a lot is rather than these previous two models, which took a very sort of Australia and Asia point of view, I mean, I myself have been researching and working and collaborating across the Asia Pacific in my previous roles for about 10 to 15 years. And so really the sort of major shift that I wanted to reorient was that the triennial celebrated and explored and probed Australia's place as an Asia Pacific country. Asia Pacific being kind of our geographic neighbourhood, it's where we are in the world in Australia, but also thinking about Australia's dominant cultural narratives and the fact that, you know, we are a member of the Asia Pacific, but we have a very specific British colonial heritage, and that sort of mainstream Australian culture is very dominated by that legacy. You know, it's very white. A lot of the sort of mainstream arts and cultural institutions have white or British colonial leadership, and the majority of work on those stages is, and I think like a lot of our colleagues in Asia, actually very beholden to Europe as the kind of cultural North Star that we look to for our, the sort of benchmarking of not only contemporary art, but what contemporary culture is and what ideas we circulate and what sensibilities we respond to. So for me, a festival like Asiatopa is about thinking about our kind of cultural context in Australia very differently, both being situated in the Asia Pacific as our geographic neighbourhood, but also an increasing part of our cultural inheritance in Australia. Of course, there were waves of exchange between our First Peoples and the Indigenous peoples of the Asia Pacific region before colonisation, and Australia's Asian story of Asian immigration is as old as the British colonial story, if not older. So increasingly, this is where our so many of our citizens have roots and cultural heritage as well, yet that's rarely reflected in the kind of cultural output that you see in our work. So for me, a triennial like Asiatopa has a very important role to play in shifting the cultural conversation around how we talk about ourselves, who we think we are, and where our sort of artistic and cultural lineages and inheritances are. And in that sort of, I guess that research has then led me to think a lot about what it means to be a good neighbour, actually. How we can come together across differences and divides and imagine new futures. And what are the different ways a triennial festival can make new connections between people? One of the other things that I love about Asiatopa, amongst many challenges, is that it is a triennial festival. And I was thinking a lot about what this kind of unique mode of the triennial can deliver to a place, both to a artist community across the Asia Pacific, but also a local audience. And in a practical sense, having that 3-year cycle affords us the opportunity to commission a lot of new work, and a lot of the work, about 40% of the new performances in Asiatopa next year will be new commissions, which is quite a high proportion for a sort of festival of our kind in Australia. It means that we can not only sort of support work from the initial stages of an idea, but support it through multiple creative development cycles, and really see through that process, which includes a lot of collaborations with Faith and with River and with Ki Hong, a lot of kind of colleagues, and it gives us the time to sort of stitch those threads together and build more robust resources behind a project, but also build a more sort of in-depth and meaningful conversation about what that artist is doing, and you know, layers of meaning that sort of means that when the work lands and opens in the festival, it opens in a much richer context. I think triennial is also an opportunity to capture a particular moment in time and think about where we are right now in the world, and really create a kind of conversation between the local context of Melbourne and the sort of very broad international network that we engage with to put the festival together. I had a bunch more links, but I think I'm just going to talk. I think, you know, one of the other things in terms of how I've been situating Asiatopa and this idea of Australia as an Asia-Pacific country has led me to think about particularly sort of the relationship between the Australian and international artists that we work with. We commission artists from all over the region to create new work, but therefore when we're thinking about the politics of Australian art and the Australian art world, I found myself having to really define, because also Melbourne's cultural calendar is very crowded. There's a festival every week. There's a real plethora of cultural institutions, and we really had to think about what our unique role is. And I think it's both about this cultural conversation around the Asia Pacific, but it's also about whose voices we foreground in in the Australian landscape. And so when I think about, when we've sort of formed a rationale around thinking about the Australian artists that we work with and prioritising, for me, you cannot think about the idea of Australia as an Asia-Pacific country without foregrounding the voices of our First Peoples. Australia has over 300 First Nations peoples of diverse language groups who are increasingly sort of being elevated rightfully to the centre of the cultural conversation in Australia. And these First Nations communities have their own relationships to the Asia-Pacific region. Actually, maybe we can bring up the third slide, the third link. This is a project actually that we're developing, if you scroll down to some of the images, that's been initiated by a group of Yolngu artists from Northeast Arnhem Land in Australia in collaboration with a group of Taiwan and Amis artists here in Taiwan. And these artists met through a lab in the last Asiatopa and rediscovered an ancestral connection that was based on a Yolngu songline of the Yolngu people having been visited by an ancestor thousands of years ago before colonization. And that ancestor is now believed to be of First Nations Taiwanese origin. So these kind of very unique stories that come out of Australia that are around our place in the Asia Pacific, outside the colonial narrative or beyond the British colonial narrative, and exploring how a sort of rediscovery of these kind of ties or these reinstatement of these Indigenous knowledge systems can point towards a different kind of future for us in the region. So First Nations artists were super important to me. Obviously, there are a lot of Australian people and artists of Asia-Pacific cultural heritage of the diaspora, and that was a really important conversation that hadn't been included in previous Asiatopas. So really elevating the voices of our Asia-Pacific diaspora artists was really important to me in formulating the ideas of our program. And then also thinking about any artist, any Australian artist from any cultural background, in fact, who had forged or was forging deep mutual ties with their Asia-Pacific peers from across the region based on sort of self-determination and mutual interest. And Anthony Hamilton from Chunky Move is here, who is creating a new work for Asiatopa in collaboration with Gabba Modus Operandi from Indonesia. And also Luke George and Daniel Koch just landed in Taiwan to perform Hundreds and Thousands next week, Luke being from Melbourne and Daniel being Singaporean. And they've been collaborating for over a decade. So really being able to honour those self-determined artist-led ties that are developing in the region. So I just wanted to share that as some of my kind of curatorial thinking behind how I am approaching Asiatopa, and I think there's probably a lot more to talk about, but I'll hand it back to you, River.
Perhaps, Jeff, could you add a little bit, like, for example, the focus of shifting or in dialogue with the very particular Australian art world and context that you sort of like began this Asia-Pacific statement and working method with artists like from your previous position at Performance Space in Sydney. And so before arriving in Asiatopa, you've been already working on such notion and questions to these ecosystems.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always worked in the Asia Pacific, but I guess it came into a particular focus in my previous job as the artistic director of Performance Space in Sydney, where as part of my time there, we created a new annual festival called LiveWorks. That was a festival focused more on the experimental end of practice, but really with also a view towards the Asia Pacific. And at the time, there was even less, perhaps, representation of Asia-Pacific arts and culture on our stages in Australia. And at the same time, I'd started to experience the work of all of these incredible artists from the Asia-Pacific, like Isa Hoxton, for example, and Choi Ka-fai, who were our neighbours, literally, but who would tour Europe or the United States before Australia wasn't on any of their radars, even though their work is so relevant to our kind of context. And I actually saw Isa's work and met her at the Time-Based Art Festival in Portland, in Oregon, and was like, you have to come to Australia. This work would speak to our audience. And I think, there are so many kind of cultural conversations which I think would be of interest to these artists. So really it was about trying to kind of create a platform that forged stronger and deeper connections. And LiveWorks being annual, we had the chance to build that year on year and invite artists back. I think Isa presented 4 works over 3 years at LiveWorks. Choi Ka-fai presented 3 works over about 3 years. So, creating these kind of ways for these artists to start to come and engage with our context, but also for audiences to get to know their work and really sort of deepen those ties over a number of years. And so that, I think I was sort of at Performance Space over about the cycle of 8 or 9 LiveWorks festivals. And actually, they've just launched the new LiveWorks program last week, and it looks fantastic. It's in October. But I guess that over the course of that was when I was coming to Adam, when I was doing a lot of research in the region where Faith and I really started connecting, where Ki Hong and I worked together a lot. And I guess that sort of experience furnished me with this body of research and this network and knowledge, which meant that when the Asiatopa job came up, it seemed like the right next step.
We could expect that during the discussion, perhaps Jeff could share with us more about also some layered shifts between these two positionings now landing in Asiatopa within another kind of like institutional context. And in terms of the diversifying the artistic expressions in relation to the very specific cultural diversity and society, perhaps Daniel, would you like to tell us more about Kunstfestival Desa?
Thanks a lot. Thanks, River, and everybody. So my name is Daniel Blanca-Gubai. I'm based in Brussels, where I'm at the artistic co-direction of Kunstfestival des Arts, which is a festival of performing art that happens once per year, every year in the month of May, that exists since almost 30 years. Now, next May will be the 30th edition of the festival. It has been created by a wonderful curator whose name was Free Leisen, who had this vision of creating a big festival in the city of Brussels. I was sharing this a little bit before, but Brussels has a very specific cultural landscape in the sense that the culture is divided between 2 linguistic communities, so the French-speaking and the Flemish, both inhabiting the city, but theaters and museum either belong to one community or the other. And there was no institution that was bringing together the 2 communities. So the idea of Frileisen, in a very in an amazing way. She went to the Flemish community saying that the French-speaking wanted to have a festival together, and the other way around, even though it was not true. And, and she managed to convince the two ministries to put money together to create a festival. And I'm saying this because somehow this is still very much embedded in the meaning of the festival today, which is a cultural institutions whose aim is, first of all, to support artistic creations, but also to think, what does it mean to have a festival at the scale of the city? How a festival can change the habits of citizens in going only to some places. So this idea of circulation between of the audience in other venues is something that is really central. So it's a festival that happens in 25, 30 different locations every year in the month of May. And it's really, we think a lot via the image of the city somehow. Which doesn't mean at all that it's a kind of city festival or done only with artists coming or inhabiting the city. On the contrary, from the very beginning was the idea of a very international festival. And this was also something that was inscribed at the beginning of the festival, because Brussels was labeled at the time a little bit like the idea of the capital of Europe. And the idea was really to provincialize Europe, just like to do a very international festival that would show the artistic language happening in many different regions of the world and the way in which it would resonate in Brussels. So still today, so Dries Duiby and myself, we are at the direction of the festival since 2018. And we are, the festival evolved, so there are new things. The city is no longer the city that was there in the 90s when the festival was created. We can no longer speak of two communities. There's a kind of demographic richness of multi-layer communities that is present in the city, but still we are very faithful to the original mission of the festival, thinking what's the meaning of doing a festival today and what does it mean an international festival today. And an important element to share is that since the beginning, the idea of the festival was to have what we call a creation festival. So most of the works that are presented at the festival are premiering at the festival or are supported, are co-produced, are commissioned or co-commissioned, and they are presented at the festival for the first time, which was a bit what I was sharing today in the workshop with the participants of the Curatoké. What does it mean? And it's a very, for me, very dear question. What does it mean to deal with not selecting works, but accompanying works? How can we see the act of curation as an idea of following a process, and a process that is not always given, that can go in unforeseen directions, but where the element of the unknown, as we were saying this morning, is at the core of it. How can we recognize it? How can we acknowledge this? But also how can we grant to the artist the possibility of living, of cohabiting with the unknown in the process of creation? Because this is a way through which we can accompany artists in taking more risks, in not reproducing what they know already about their own practice, to experiment more. And this is what we stand for. How can we experiment? How can we support artists in taking risks, in finding new languages, in doing something that is not yet present in their practice? And this is not only done with emerging artists, but also very, very, mid-career or artists that are well affirmed, still they have always this possibility of rediscovering their own practice, of adventuring in something that is not yet existing in their practice. And this is what we look for in the artistic scene. This is what we try to support, the idea of supporting artists and the art scene in taking risks, in experimenting, in creating something that is not the reproduction of the existent, but something that might be challenging for the artists, but might be challenging also for the audience. This is something that we defend a lot. The idea that an audience as well can be challenged by being faced with something that is not yet known, that somehow it shifts the parameters through which we used to look at performance, that somehow deterritorialize our way of looking at things. So when I was saying that we are a co-commissioning, is that very often we try to work with other partners, both in Brussels and internationally. This becomes more and more important in the idea of trying to support together artists. How together we can follow the desire of the artists in creating more ambitious projects. So this is something we try to do a lot. How can we go beyond what might seem to be the scale of the feasible? Just like to follow the dreams of the artists in something that is not easy to create. So as I was saying, we have every year 35 projects, more or less, which means that we work simultaneously on multiple editions. Because somehow now, for example, we are working on the edition of 2025, but already on the one of 2026, some case 27, because we know the time that is needed for artists to create new works, which makes it has the complexity of not having the possibility of finishing one edition to understand what we want to do next, but at the same time, it's has this kind of excitement of continuously working on multiple editions at the same time. And as I was saying, most of the artists are not based in Brussels, but also something that we've been focusing on lately was trying to break this dichotomy, this opposition between local and international, which is still very present sometimes in the art scene. So very often we have, I'm saying this because actually Brussels is a city, as many other cities, where it's full of artists who are not from Brussels, who live there. So the idea also of recognizing who is local, who's not local is there's a kind of porosity that we need to acknowledge and also politically to defend. And so more and more we have collaborations between artists who are based in Brussels and not based in Brussels, where we try also to highlight how these categories sometimes are limited to speak about the contemporary political landscape. And as I was saying, if there's one parameter that we try to stick to is this idea of defending the idea of taking risks, of experimenting, and we as a festival together with the artists. What does it mean to take risk? What does it mean to produce new works, to commission new works, to engage in forms that we do not fully understand, but we are confident that we will understand at a certain moment together with the artist the way in which we have to present something. And this is built in the kind of trust relation that we try to build with the artists, where somehow we try to follow a bit the waves through which artistic creation evolve without trying to shape it too much at the beginning. There's one element that we defend a lot, both in the conversation with the artists, but especially with the press and the government, because we are a public institution. And exactly because we are a public institution, lately I found myself very often explaining that being a public institution, which is something I take very seriously, it means that we organize a festival with taxpayer money, which means that we have to have a festival which is open to the city, where everybody who's potentially interested in coming needs to have the accessibility to come. But at the same time, while defending the openness of the festival, it's important not to somehow transform this in the idea that the festival needs to be a space of consensus, where everybody needs to like the project. And I'm saying this because this is part of a very populist discourse that is emerging in Belgium, at least, but in Europe in general, where the idea is that if you are doing experimental work, you might be labeled as elitist, as an institution, while we defend that it's not at all about being elitist or populist. It's more about the fact that we as a public institution, our goal is to create experiences that might challenge our way of looking at the world, that might raise questions more than give answers, that might raise doubts more than certainties, and where somehow projects can also be disliked, but the worst would be to be indifferent to this project. What is the most important is just like that these projects can activate a kind of public debate. And I'm saying this because it's something I'm very busy with at the moment. How can we defend the idea of a public institution which is not a space of consensus, but on the contrary, which can be a space of debate, of agonism even, but where somehow everybody can be concerned, not because they like everything, but because they find that everything is relevant today. And in maybe one last thing that I would like to share about the festival is that we try to follow as much as possible the way in which the city is evolving, to be listening to what might, how the city evolved and how we as a festival respond to it, how the world is evolving and how do we as a festival respond to it, but also how artistic creation is evolving in terms of content, but also in terms of ways of producing. Some years ago, for example, we realized that more and more we were in conversation with artists who were busy in creating forms of experimental pedagogy as artistic practice. So we've been dealing with all this kind of pedagogical turn of artists creating fictional schools, fictional institutions as an artistic project. And that somehow it was important for them and for us not to label this kind of practice, sharing of knowledge, simply as workshops, but actually to give them the centrality of artistic projects and to recognize that this is an artistic form in itself. So we created a whole part of the festival, which is called Free School, because it's a kind of school, it's a kind of imaginary school, very speculative, that we open every year, completely free for the participants, but where every year we experiment with new ways of sharing knowledge that exist in the artistic practice. The way in which the artistic ecosystem is experimenting with ways of sharing knowledge that have been marginalized or invisibilized by the epistemology in Western modernity, in the idea that everything needs to be verbalized or everything needs to be quantified. And the importance of recognize other ways of being together and sharing knowledge or producing knowledge together. And it's something that where we work very much on what has been invisibilized as knowledge in a city like Brussels. Very often we speak about invisibilized knowledge more than invisible knowledge because nothing is invisible in itself. It just has been invisibilized, but what is the hegemonic paradigm of knowledge in a city like Brussels? But it has been an interesting experiment in understanding how as an institution, as a festival, we are not only welcoming projects, but we might also, or we are not only hosts, but we might also be guests of new forms. We might also displace our way of working to meet conditions that were not yet part of the practice of the festival, but that we try to implement. Maybe I will conclude here.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. I guess some of us agree. There's a few sentences that Daniel addressed that it doesn't need to be a festival based on everybody's conscience. Like you don't need to be like the festival programs to be able to define the value of the festival. This is challenging. Yeah, like Kyoto Experiment Festival, National Theatre Taiwan, TPAC here. Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is really, I mean, of course, it has to be thought-provoking conversation in here, and because it is a thought-provoking and activist job, I would say, when we are being in a different positioning regarding curating or practicing curatorial actions and notions and in dialogues in a large scope of people, whether it's artists or community members and audiences. Yeah, Faith, would you like to continue and share us about what's on in Singapore?
Hey. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you to River and to TPAC. I think the fact that we're all gathered here today from very different backgrounds is a really important layer of the festival, of all the programs that are happening now. It's really with a lot of appreciation that we're able to meet each other and spend time together in Taipei because of this kind of program dedicated to different kinds of professionals. So thank you so much for that, River. So my name is Faith. I'm the Director of Dance, Theatre and Visual Arts Programming at the Esplanade in Singapore. In the course of my work for over 20 years working in the performing arts, I've had to wear many different kinds of hats and play different kinds of roles in programming itself, from producing to commissioning new work, to working very intimately with artists to create the work, as well as handling the management of programming department in a large institution. And because I work directly inside the Esplanade itself, the National Theatre of Singapore, that means that my approach to my work, I take a very developmental way of thinking about the work that I do, and I think a lot about creating platforms that can focus on artistic development and audience development over a very long period of time. I work in programming in many different kinds of formats, from large scale to smaller, more experimental types of platforms. But what I'm most passionate about through the work I do is bringing and supporting contemporary artists. Particularly, I've been working with a lot of contemporary choreographers that ordinarily would not receive support and that would not be easily programmed in Singapore and in Asia. And for me, this is with the view to expand the different kinds of perspectives that we can have in defining actually what is contemporary and who we are today, and give particular attention to define it from our own terms, away from what has been more in the mainstream, which is largely Western-dominated types of aesthetics and definitions and discourses. I think my intention in my programming often responds to the big gaps that we have in programming in Singapore, and there is a tendency towards more mainstream works actually in the landscape of performing arts in Singapore itself. Okay, so let me just show you a little bit of the city. I think it's useful to think about the National Arts Centre very much connected to the city itself, the politics and the people and its development and culture. Singapore is actually a very small island, but it feels like a big city when you're in it. We're situated in Southeast Asia, and actually we're really young. We're only 59 years old when we gained our independence and separated from Malaysia. The city has a population of over 6 million people, and culturally it's actually really diverse, which informs a lot of the cultural programming that we do. There are 3 main ethnic groups that are in Singapore that came from the immigrants that settled to work in Singapore, which are from China, India, and Malaysia. And actually, because it's such a capital for the economy and trade, we also have a lot of people who now call Singapore home because they work in the city itself. Interestingly, in our history, we were colonized by the British, which explains why our main language of work and education is in English. And a lot of the laws and systems that we still have today came from actually that colonial period. And a lot of this actually informs how the Esplanade, the National Theatre, actually runs. Also interesting, I think, to understand about the context of Singapore and how the performing arts have to interact with it is that the funding is very centralized, and the main source of funding is from the government. It's highly regulated and also highly subsidized. do not yet have different kinds of alternative sources of funding. We don't have a history of philanthropy or foundations that are able to kind of independently give to initiatives in the arts. Arts and culture and infrastructure on this kind of mega scale arrived only in the year 2000. Esplanade actually was a major part of the infrastructure plan, and we opened in 2002. So again, kind of a very young history of having this professional stages and national theatre. Major milestone for the development of arts and culture in Singapore, because we had never before had a dedicated space and staff. So a National Arts Centre like this employs like 200 staff, and we all had to learn on the job how to arrive at that kind of professional level, with a lot of course, trial and error, but also now we've arrived at a point where we're training technical staff as well. They actually go on to train other staff from around the region and around Asia. So we were really learning how to operate, and in that sense also, along with this kind of infrastructure and expertise, we were learning how to program and create a program that made sense to the community in Singapore. When we first started, like all big projects that are funded by the government and by the city, there were a lot of concerns from the artistic community and from the people of the city itself. Again, they were worried. I mean, we've heard about this idea of art only for the elite. And because you have this kind of infrastructure, people also kind of tended towards, would this only be for people of course, a certain economic background as well. So I think addressing those concerns, the site itself in terms of the National Arts Centre, as well as the programming, really needed to think about that diversity of needs in the community and become open in many ways, open in the spaces itself. So you'll see in the images, but if you've been to Singapore, it is very much a community space where people can hang around and not have to pay money to go into the building or be outside by the bay itself. We do a lot of free programs for the community, I think a lot about the programming itself is very diverse in terms of genres and art forms, as well as different kinds of levels of engagement. So just very broadly, in terms of having a big organization, the priorities then also stay very close towards the city and the social needs itself. So one area that we work on is inclusion and well-being, and we actually work with artists to create experiences and performances and workshops for different community groups like youth at risk, people with dementia, and social inclusion. Another big part of our direction of our programs is also to develop a next generation of both practitioners who can run the theatre, programmers, as well as artists from Singapore. And then a kind of big term that we have is creative futures, and we're thinking a lot about how to make our programs and our buildings sustainable for the future and engage with issues that are prevalent now, such as like emerging technologies. When you have a space, it also needs to develop with time, thinking about spaces digitally as well. So we actually are launching an archive of all our works that we've presented so that people can see it from beyond Singapore too, and be a repository as well to everything that we've worked on. And also, of course, importantly, thinking about the artistic development for the future, thinking about contemporary works in terms of commissions and co-productions that we do not only for Singapore artists, but Asian artists as well as international artists. I just want to give you a sense of space very quickly. We have over, I believe, 12 venues, 3 of which are for the public and for free performances. The main venues we have are a 2,000 seat theatre. We also have a 1,600 concert hall, and recently we added a 600 seat theatre to our spaces. We have studio spaces for more intimate performances, and we only have one rehearsal studio space, which is very, very difficult. But we're slowly trying to carve out more spaces where we can have rehearsals in. Otherwise, we actually have to rent from outside. Just another kind of sense of like the big mega kind of concert hall. But just imagine that we didn't have all these spaces before. So it's really important for different kinds of artists that we have this level of infrastructure. Yeah, these are the free community spaces in the building, an outdoor theater celebrating National Day. So we're part of a big kind of cultural district by the bay. Just give me a second. Okay, so coming into specifically our programming, so if you have this big infrastructure, you're thinking of programs throughout the whole year. So a lot of the approach has been how to build habit. How do we convince Singaporeans to actually spend their time or their money in the performing arts? And before the center had been established, actually the context of audiences in Singapore is that they're not accustomed actually to coming and watching performances at all. There was the Singapore International Festival, which was a major highlight, but it was only once a year. So really it's a big challenge and task for the team for the past 20 years and continuing on now post-COVID into a very different landscape where people are connected to entertainment through devices and etc. How do we still maintain that a live experience is a very important part of their life and their culture? So we built a whole year of programs, which includes 30 over festivals. If you can imagine, we run 30 over festivals and platforms, and in different genres. So for example, in music, we have an alternative music festival, a jazz festival, a classical music platform. And how do we do this programming? So the programming team is very large. We have 40 programmers, and each are at very different levels of experience. A majority of them are quite young and still learning on the job. And then we have also a bunch of us that have been here for quite a long time. So it's quite horizontal in the way that we approach the programming team, in that a lead programmer will take the lead of one of these platforms, but we also can determine if they do that collectively with a team in selecting and thinking about the experiences of a program, or they can also independently lead in the curation and the programming of it. But because you have the infrastructure of a department and a director, it's a very kind of supportive atmosphere to passing on experience and also accepting that everybody's going to have their own journey to learn and develop their own program, and that at every level there's a value to the experience that they can bring, because we're all from also very different generations. The challenge is that the programmer not only has to curate and program, but actually execute, handling the management, the project management, the producing of the work itself. So that can be actually very difficult to focus on research in programming and spending time developing relationships. So just quickly to show you the different scenes from our programs. We also have a dedicated team for children's programming, which runs a children's festival and also works very closely with the schools to do an artist to create programs based on school curriculum, actually, bringing art and education together. Under the children's programming, we've actually commissioned international work. So we embed both works from both international artists and Singaporean artists and Asian artists side by side in all of our platforms, and that's one approach that we take. Because I mentioned about the three main ethnicities in Singapore that have different, very strong traditional and cultural roots in their communities, we have actually three different cultural festivals which celebrate the art from the Indian, Malay, and Chinese communities in Singapore. And again, that includes also commissioning artists from outside of Singapore. For example, this was a concert that we commissioned by Indonesian filmmaker Garan Nugroho with a live gamelan orchestra. Yeah. This is Stan Lai's work in the Chinese festival. We've, of course, had a very long relationship with Taiwan's Cloudgate Dance Theatre. And we also did a project with Kaohsiung and a partner in Hong Kong too. Okay, so coming to my work specifically, whilst I'm the overall programming director, my more kind of curatorial hat has been most worn looking after dance programming. So I was the director of our International Dance Festival for 15 years. And I recently transformed the festival into 5 weekends. And each weekend has a particular thematic focus, which is very intentional in terms of how I was thinking about developing audiences and kind of taking them away from a festival format where they were treated to a very wide range of different things, but it was a little bit in a touch and go situation where they were consuming things. And I wanted to find a way to have more time to stay with one focal point and unpack it through different kinds of dialogues and counterpoints, which is why we designed these different weekends. And really with the point to stimulate a lot more thinking and dialogue, with starting off from the point of dance, but relating it to much bigger issues. Also encouraging, because the tendency in Singapore with audiences is that, again, with a very consumption mindset, they watch a work, but they don't necessarily dig into an artistic practice or wanting to understand an artist much deeper than what you see on stage. So these weekends really offer us an opportunity to be able to introduce artistic practice in a more kind of deeper way to the audience. So one important platform that I wanted to just highlight is Connect Asia Now. It's a very new platform, but it actually continues the good work that we've done over 20 years in supporting the presentation and commission or co-production of works from Asian choreographers. Another layer that I added into this platform is to have a meeting for international presenters and programmers to come to Asia, because again, it was really important for them to, like with Adam, discover Asia from within here on our terms. So that's another international visit program that is part of Connect Asia Now. I mentioned it actually in the workshop yesterday, but for the majority of people here, I did want to say that when it comes to working within Asia, I think that there are two main aspects that a lot of us, a lot of colleagues here in the room have to contend with in our ecosystem. One of that can be censorship. It's a very real regulation of what you can or cannot get presented, what can or cannot be funded, and the impact on our artistic community and our development of our audiences is very real too. So I think for programmers or for producers working in this scene, this is something that we have to very carefully navigate and negotiate with as part of like our curatorial strategies and also very practical strategies. The consequence of that is the direct impact on artists and how they have to find alternative sources of funding outside of their community due to, say, censorship, or even just the fact of lack of resources in some particular areas where there's very small funding for contemporary performing arts. So you can imagine that when they do have to seek funding from the outside, and they also want to have audiences appreciate their work beyond their city, for an Asian artist, it presents quite a big paradox of wanting their work to be supported, wanting a sophisticated audience and getting the recognition they deserve, but then having to always negotiate being seen through a very exotic and colonial lens. And this is sometimes perpetuated by curators or programmers programmers who are taking care of major platforms overseas who don't have those sensitivities, or don't. Sometimes it's not even that, they just don't have the resources or the time to really dedicate to giving a new context of understanding, because majority of these international audiences are so used to seeing themselves as a central starting point to how to read Asian artist work. So this is again for me, I think, a really important consideration that we have to really begin to understand, because if not, I think it's a responsibility, because if not, we as programmers can perpetuate that when we're commissioning work and when we're also supporting artists to go outside of Asia as well. Let me show you some of the works that we have in Connect Asia now this year. Sankai Juku, actually one of the last works that Amagatsu choreographed before his passing, so very poignant. We have worked for a very long time with Isa Jokson as well, supporting her work into audiences in Singapore. And it's been really nice because introducing her many years back, now I see people actually like super excited that she's coming. So I feel like it's a mark of like, yes, we've done something right, you know. For the first time, we're presenting Joshua Serafin. He's been to Singapore to show work in progress and will be co-producing Pulse, his new work. Last year, we supported Kong Khan. She is a dancer from Pichek Klunchun's company. We have a very long relationship of supporting Pichek Klunchun. So what's very fulfilling for me, working in such a long term of development, is seeing the next generation that comes from of Asian choreographers, from the fact that they could be supported by a more senior generation, and that we were able to journey along and as Daniel says very beautifully, accompany one generation to the next of choreographers. Last year, we also supported the development of Melati's work. She's an Indonesian visual and artist and performance artist. We did this actually as a co-production with Jeff and with River. So what's also very nice, I think, is that we're able to come together and support the work in so many different ways and then enable it to travel. Also, what's interesting with Melati is most of her practice is a solo practice in visual arts context. So another thing that I try to pay attention to is giving artists the opportunity to do something that they ordinarily don't have the opportunity to do. So in this piece, she proposed to work with dancers and be sitting out of the work and be a choreographer too. Yeah. We also presented Tao, and to balance off all that kind of more contemporary stuff that, you know, is very highly subsidized. It is a national arts center. We have big venues. I think some of you will know, nodding, know this. And it's also important to show work of different scale and from our international colleagues too, because it informs a lot of the audiences. So part of our programming is also international productions as well in the big spaces. This was a mega one from Manchester, commissioned and produced by Manchester, Tree of Codes, very, very technically challenging, I have to say, survived it. We also support forms that are very beloved in the arts community, so with classical ballet, and where and even within things that are very established, we try and put an important mark in it. So with our ballet weekend, we were trying to introduce more Asian ballet dancers in the productions as well. So, you know, just to address that kind of inequality with diversity in ballet itself. So really kind of with every aspect, just thinking how we can really push the boundaries to center it a bit more to perspectives that are important. We have a theatre studio season that is dedicated to work from performance and text. some of the works. And also just lastly to say that layered onto presentation modes of engagement, we also have development platforms as well. So for example, I started a residency that was focused solely on research, and this is because I was responding to the need that in Singapore, a lot of people were rushing towards production very quickly. So I wanted to validate and legitimize and fund research process itself. And the residency is also open to not only artists, but to dramaturgs, programmers, and curators as well. Yeah. And just to say, we also have a dance lab program that's going to be part of Connect Asia now. This year, there's actually a Taiwanese choreographer who will be part of it. Yep, so it was a lot. Sorry to take up so much time, but just to share, a National Arts Centre does many things. So there's a lot to share. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Faith. I feel like, oh, I was in Singapore again. I was there at the CAN
Yes.
camp. Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's really, perhaps I wanted to like respectively also propose a question for each of you to elaborate further. Yeah, for example, because by hearing Faith work over nearly 2 decades in Esplanade, like for me, I mean, we share the similarity of like working in and working for institutional context is also mostly building up the cultural infrastructure. Yeah, because the large art center in Asia fashionably arrived over the past few decades. And then, however, a lot of things and people are await for be cultivated. Audiences, never enough audiences, never enough artists, never enough international visibilities, never enough understanding to our neighbors in Asia Pacific. And so, for example, how did you arrive in your Singapore dance community that you wanted to do that dance festival? And then how it was lasting for 15 years, and then you wanted to shift into a series of dance seasonal program as part of the institutional language, and then dedicated to different communities. Well, what's the concern of serving those different community members of artists and audiences, and how dance festival to different dance focuses been evolving for you?
Yeah, and also mapped out against the venues as well. Because once you're working in a art center, the type of programs has to be very directly correlated to the logics and the economics of space. So the dance festival was part of all the other festivals that we were going to program anyway. So it was in that way in our direction already. So it was more about how to do it. And I think the approach often with these kinds of spaces and the numbers that you have to kind of, be responsible for, large numbers, is balance. So, and also that even within programs that are larger, there can be a lot of meaning in how and what they are to developing the audiences in Singapore. So it's important. I think the approach that I took was really to be very, very careful with that balance, to satisfy the basic kind of needs of a big venue in terms of numbers, but carve out spaces where those bigger programs could actually subsidize the more experimental and the more contemporary. So that was, I think, a key approach. And in terms of the listening a lot to the community's needs, so really being there in the studio watching the development from the artistic practices point of view to watching the audience. In the first years of the festival, I mean, even till now, I spend so much time just looking at the faces of the audience that we have to just gauge and understand how they're responding and feeling the program too. So it's a lot of, I think, sensitive kind of observation. Yeah.
Yeah, and during the process, how did you build up your own method while commissioning artists?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's hard to articulate your own intuitive sensibility.
How did you become Isa Hassan's mom?
Oh, I'm not. No, I'm not. But respectfully, a big supporter of her work. I think you're informed by also what you kind of absorb around your community, and I gravitated towards always more interesting and challenging ideas of what is contemporary. Yeah. So, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And Jeff, could you? I also, it's quite relevant to each other. Like, for example, when you previously working at a performance space, that you also initiated that Life Forest Festival, and then so if for you the curatorial practices or curating, the process of curating, the action of curating is also dealing with or responding to certain need of community, like they need something like this, so that's make a festival happen to bring people together to visualize places and bodies and voices. Like how did you? What's the process for you? And then now in another new context in Asia Topa, what kind of static, and strategies that you wanted to perform when you are now really very much focused on the task and mission of Asia Pacific art?
Yeah, I think as a curator, I mean, we're all always we are in our profession because of artists, really, and I really resonate with what you're saying, Faith, in terms of just really, and this idea of accompanying artists as well, because sometimes you don't know where you're going as a curator or where you're leading the audience because it's led by artists and their process. And I think one of the reasons I am a curator is because I believe that artists enact change in the world or imagine alternatives, and it's a sort of privilege and an honor to be able to help those alternative worlds come into being. And so this idea around the formulation of curatorial ideas or concepts is always, for me, in the first instance, led by artistic practice and the kinds of interventions that artists are making in the world with both form and ideas. And then with our bodies of research, noticing where there are parallel threads of conversation that other artists or practitioners are having, or whether there are divergent opinions or divergent positions that are interesting to juxtapose and bring into relationship with each other. And so I believe that sort of a festival or a platform or a triennial is an opportunity to have that conversation. And that conversation is always sparked and led by artists, and part of my role as a curator is to shepherd that conversation and to broaden it, and to offer both the artists and the audiences that we're working with a complexity or a kind of depth of conversation or a richness of conversation around how these different art forms and practices relate to contemporary life and the world that we're living in, and help us filter or understand or challenge the world or imagine a different world that is perhaps more equitable or fair or just or hopeful or joyful or any number of things. And so, I guess all of those ideas were sort of amplified when I came to Asia Topa, and one of the things I thought a lot about really from Live Works, which was a festival of experimental art with an Asia Pacific focus, to Asiatopa, which is sort of has Asia Pacific in the sort of headline and really at the center of the conversation. Is what is it specifically about Asia Pacific perspectives that is important to bring together, or what are the distinct possibilities around these practices? So one of the first steps I made, I guess, in my research and formulation of the program was this kind of looking to what we're sort of thinking around as the pioneering elders of Asia Pacific performance, the artists who have kind of defined the field of what Asia Pacific contemporary performance is and created space for new generations of experimental innovators or artists from different perspectives or different generations. So that for me, a moment like Asiatopa also becomes a conversation between generations and not looking at these hierarchies of the kind of opposing or diametric generations of artists and artistic movements, but this kind of porosity of exchange between generations, which I think was also something that is particular to a lot of Asia-Pacific cultures, and these kind of systems of family and kinship that we also see reflected in a lot of our artistic and cultural lineages. So how can a festival sort of break down those hierarchies and be a sort of coming together across generations to imagine our moment differently? So those are some of the ideas that I'm working with.
And Daniel? Because you briefly also introduced the festival history to us, and then I think freelancers' impact has been still influential in this ecosystem with the very spirit, fearless spirit of the making, creating, and supporting the art ecosystem and community. And in terms of the very recent, or for me more clear festival statement that actually you mentioned about, like, this is a festival of challenging ways of understanding the world or seeing the world. And I think in continuation with this kind of like experimental and radical statement and spirits, like, what's the challenge for you that you wanted to address in order to challenge, and what kind of world that you wanted to change through this festival making?
I would say that it's very much what also Faith was saying before, that we being in a festival in Europe today, we carry the legacy of a very specific and colonial way of looking at the world that is still very present. And I think that part of what has been there since the very beginning of the festival, in the desire of Free, was to, and what I was mentioning this morning, was the possibility of inviting artists with their singularity, with their singular artistic visions, that does not have to correspond, but actually it can challenge the expectation that an audience might have in Brussels, or in general a Western audience might have. And I truly believe that the theater is an amazing tool for this, because it's not only a place where we look at bodies, but it's also a place where we look at the way in which we look at them. Somehow that challenges what is our expectation that we had from shows coming from a specific geographical areas or from a specific artist. And I think that this kind of friction between the expectation and what we are looking at in front of us, it's part of this challenging experience that needs to be provided by the festival. Our role as a festival is not to confirm the vision and very often the stereotype vision. And I think that if this discourse was relevant years ago, it's even more relevant today, because unluckily the tendency in which we are, despite the whole discourse that we can create, is that we are more and more connected in a very beautiful way. But this also means that we are in a globalized system. We are more and more in Western Europe submerged by narratives that arrive from other parts of the world, very often in a very reduced and stereotyped way. And in this sense, I think that there is a kind of narrative that exists already. We are already connected. Everybody in Brussels has the perception of knowing what happens in other parts of the world. And this is the problem, that somehow this pretension of knowing very often doesn't push people in doing more research about, okay, but what exactly is happening? Or how can I explore something that might be more complex than the pre-digested image that I received from the media, friends, narratives, mainstream discourse. And in this sense, I think that somehow what is to be challenged is the monolithic vision that we might have of culture, of the arts, of the present. And this doesn't mean that every work needs to be a political work. This can also be, and I was referring to this morning, I strongly defend as well, and very often provocatively push this, that it's important, and it's the example I was making this morning, from a context that it's a bit closer to where I come from, which is like the Arabic-speaking world, where very often artists in a kind of acceleration of international circulation, artists coming from the Arabic-speaking world are pushed to reproduce a very stereotyped way of being present on stage. And this either in the form or sometimes even in the content, to speak about certain subject that the West wishes to see emerging from a certain context. And I've been having a lot of conversations with, for example, Lebanese artists where, yeah, sure, sometimes it's super important to speak about the civil war, about the current war, about the explosion of the port, about the continuous precarization of the state. But it's also important that if there's an artist who wants to create a piece of abstract dance or a piece about quantum physics coming from this geographical area, we have to acknowledge that this is also possible. And not only possible, but we as a festival, we might go there because somehow these are works that will be less supported, because somehow the way in which we look at culture or the market or the expectation of the audience influences a lot the way in which an institution might program, just like trying to meet what these expectations are, try to provide what an audience might want to see. And in this sense, I'm speaking about challenging experience, because we might then encounter works that we do not understand how they fit our preconceived idea about looking at something. And this is the moment I like the most. Somehow the moment where we are lost in front. Okay, I didn't know that this was possible, but indeed this is not a problem of the artist, it's a problem about the audience.
Yeah, I totally agree. In having so many conversations with artists that are based overseas or trying to present themselves overseas, if it's not obviously exotic in the aesthetic or the form or language, if it's not a production that's topical to some big political or cultural moment that the West is interested in, if it's just dance it's not enough, because it's measured by the history of contemporary dance as defined by the West, because then the reference is totally from that history and that gaze. So, it looks too much like something we've seen in some postmodern, So there isn't even an attempt to understand that movement or those gestures or impulses actually could have come from a very different history and trajectory and have very specific meaning, but there's a lack of wanting to break out of that kind of knowing it all. So it's very hard, I think, for artists to position themselves in this global stage. And also, I think it's very important to know that the funding for platforms are so uneven in Asia. So there's still a mindset towards thinking that if you want an audience and you want recognition, you look towards out sometimes. You cannot help it, so because of the structure. But of course, a lot of artists are also questioning this and looking more towards what makes more sense in their context too. But I think it's something that we're all acknowledging. We're trying to be able to help. Yeah.
Yep, sure. I totally agree. And I think particularly it's something that I'm mindful of curating an Asia-Pacific triennial in a sort of post-colonial context somewhere like Australia, that I think part of the criticism that sort of had circulated around previous editions was around this idea of the performativity of cultural identity. And I think this is a lot of what Faith is talking about in terms of artists from this region looking to work abroad and not necessarily being able to escape this lens of being read through a kind of colonial view of their cultural inheritance and identity. And I think, we are in the 21st century and we're in a late capitalist global moment of flux and crisis. And I think part of sort of the foundation for me is this acknowledgement that we are all hybrid beings, and we are sort of all composed of multiple heritages and identities, and some of those are cultural and some of those are familial, some of those are aesthetic, some of those, they come from all of these different places. And something that I try and work from as a curator is this sense of kind of all of us being hybrid beings, and this idea of sort of not only like sort of performativity of a cultural identity, but also this kind of essentialism or reductivism of sort of an artist or a person to a kind of stereotype cultural heritage is something that we have to resist very, very strongly. And some of, I think, the work that we all do as a network by coming together in these international platforms and in these international moments is to be able to address these stereotypes and break them down and replace them with a more nuanced understanding of the world that's more reflective of the challenges that we actually face as local and as global communities. And I think that's something that a festival can do. I think that's work that a festival can very powerfully do. And I think something else I think around is this idea about artists' agency and their license to actually practice from a number of different perspectives. And something that I think a lot about in festival making is that, yes, we are these kind of lightning rods to address these sort of powerful cultural moments and global conversations, but we also have to think about our audiences and why they would want to engage with the platforms that we run. And that's why I think sort of Faith talk about these different scales of work and these different works that speak to different audiences, and this idea of engaging the city and bringing cultures together and being in service of the people is so important. And I think for me, it's also really important to think about a festival as a space of joy, and joy as a form of radical expression and a act of resistance in itself, and pleasure, and not necessarily entertainment, but but enjoyment, and how to create those kind of experiences where, yes, a lot of the ideas and practices might be challenging, but challenge doesn't mean adversarial. Challenge is an invitation, and I think a festival, a triennial, a platform can be an invitation that is made with generosity and with joy and with camaraderie. And this is like the craft of festival making that I'm really interested in.
Yeah. Festival as clubbing. That's what we can expect Asia Topa 25, right?
Wait and see.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's very practical and also instrumental thoughts and experiences that introduced by three of you, because I think nowadays I'm not sure if it's very clear in Taiwan, but I think in general, it's clear that festival is no longer just a container for programs or in order to present a selection of things, but also how this making and curating, whether it's co-programming or directing, like all this kind of like creative job can really generate more possibilities and dialogues and even questionings, like to dismantle something that already there, but also use the existing foundation to enlarge or to catalyze like more powerful possibilities between different community members. Yeah. In Flux, we are in the ecosystem in Flux. Let's take a break, and then you are very welcome to have informal and casual chat with our curators, and then our next section will begin around 6 p.m. Thank you.